das falsch jetzt? Nein. Dass ich da hingehe? Ah, nein, okay, okay. Meine sehr verehrten Damen, meine Herren, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, ich begrüße Sie zu unserer heutigen Live-Übertragung aus der Stiftung Brandenburger Tor hier im Max-Liebermann-Haus zur Arnheim Lecture unserer Arnheim Gastprofessorin Shaoqi Van Der Meulen. Frau Van Der Meulen, die ich auch im Namen meiner Vorstandskollegin Bianca Pichert sehr herzlich und sehr wirklich hier im Max-Liebermann-Haus am Pariser Platz begrüße. Sie ist derzeit Professorin für moderne und zeitgenössische Kunst an der Universität in Utrecht. Frau Van Der Meulen ist die 38. Dozentin seit Beginn unserer Rudolf Arnheim Gastprofessur. Benannt nach dem einst in Berlin lebenden, lehrenden und forschenden Filmhistoriker, Kunsthistoriker und Gestaltpsychologen ist die Arnheim-Professur begründet vor 21 Jahren durch eine Initiative von Horst Bredekamp, eine Kooperation von Vieren, der Humboldt Universität, heute vertreten durch Frau Professor Eva Eninger, die stellvertretende Direktorin des Instituts für Kunst- und Bildgeschichte der Humboldt Universität. Seien auch Sie sehr herzlich begrüßt, liebe Frau Eninger. Sie werden uns gleich ausführlich über unsere heutige Vortragende berichten und sie ausführlich vorstellen. Lassen Sie mich aber zuvor noch Melanie Remugière da Silva begrüßen, die als Vertreterin des Berliner Künstlerprogrammes des DAD das große Verdienst hat, dass diese Arnheim-Professur als Kooperation der Humboldt-Universität mit unserer kleinen, feinen Stiftung Brandenburger Tor, der Kulturstiftung der Berliner Sparkasse und den staatlichen Museen zu Berlin überhaupt so wirksam und wirkungsmächtig geworden ist. Denn das Künstlerprogramm des DAD organisiert die praktischen Belange des Aufenthaltes unserer Arnheim-Dozentinnen und Dozenten in Berlin. Und eben dies ist in diesen pandemischen Zeiten nicht einfacher geworden. So hätte ich auch gerne noch als vierten in unserem Bunde den Generaldirektor der Staatlichen Museen zu Berlin, Professor Michael Eisenhauer, begrüßt. Er ist leider heute verhindert, da er mit der möglichen Wiedereröffnung der Berliner Museen völlig absorbiert ist. Unsere Vortragende hingegen, Shaoqi Van Der Meulen, hat sich nicht entmutigen lassen, ihre Arnheim-Gastprofessur in diesen schwierigen Zeiten wirklich in Berlin zuzubringen. Und selbst wenn sie ihre Vorlesungen über Kunst der Europäischen Union seit den Verträgen von Maastricht in Berlin hier nicht wirklich im Hörsaal, sondern nur digital per Video hat halten können, hat dies der Wirkung ihrer Vorlesungen keinen Abbruch getan. Dass ihre heutige Arnheim Lecture mit dem schönen Titel Nights of Democracy, heute im Max-Liebermann-Haus, unmittelbar vor Kunstwerken, inmitten unserer Ausstellung des berühmten Atlas von Gerhard Richter stattfinden kann, hat Frau Van Der Meulen geradezu entzückt. Denn kaum jemand in der zeitgenössischen europäischen Kunst darf so sehr mit Recht als Night of Democracy angesprochen werden, wie Gerhard Richter gerade mit seinem Atlas, seinem Lebenswerk, einer jahrzehntelangen Auseinandersetzung mit deutscher Geschichte, was im Wechselspiel von Richters Atlas hier mit dem Birkenau-Zyklus von Richter in der Alten Nationalgalerie in Berlin geradezu offenkundig wird, völlig offenkundig wird. Beide Ausstellungen, so dürfen wir hoffen, werden in der übernächsten Woche wieder fürs Publikum geöffnet werden, also übernächste Woche wieder fürs Publikum. Gegenwärtig sieht man diese Ausstellung nur im Netz. Auch die Arnheim Lecture von Shaoqi Van Der Meulen würden natürlich viel lieber ganz live erleben. Aber ich versichere Ihnen, sie sitzt höchst wirklich und animiert, gerade neben mir, hier in der Stiftung Brandenburger Tor im Max-Liebermann-Haus und freut sich im Anschluss an ihre Lecture auf viele Fragen von Ihnen. Nochmals sehr herzlichen Dank, Frau Van Der Meulen, dass Sie hier bei uns sind. Und jetzt bitte ich Frau Professor Eninger um ihre Einführung unserer Vortragenden.
Vielen Dank, Herr Professor Schuster, für das herzliche Willkommen. And I'm going to switch to English now. My name is Eva Eninger. I'm Professor for Modern Art History, and as Deputy Director of the Institute of Art and Visual History at Humboldt University in Berlin, I would like to extend a warm welcome to everybody who has joined us tonight. I would like to express my heartfelt thank you to the Stiftung Brandenburger Tor, the Foundation Preußischer Kulturbesitz, and the German Academic Exchange Service for their continued commitment to the Rudolf Arnheim Guest Professorship. Since 2000, for over 20 years, this professorship has brought scholars and artists from around the world to the Institute of Art and Visual History, and furthered the international discourse and critical teaching on contemporary art. Generations of our students have had the opportunity to enter into conversations with our respective guest professors and to be inspired by their scholarship, their different methodologies, theoretical frameworks, and artistic practices. The topic of contemporary art deserves, or rather it necessitates, a broad international spectrum of diverse and sometimes contrasting approaches. We are glad to have such strong partners in our endeavor to provide a platform for these views and discussions. Thank you also to the Stiftung Brandenburger Tor and specifically to Franziska Fenner for hosting tonight's Arnheim Lecture and for providing the necessary infrastructure to make it accessible to a large virtual audience. And if you could gaze like I can to my left, you would see the technical intensity of this work. At this point, also let me insert one formal detail. You're of course welcome to ask questions after the lecture, and please indicate your wish to do so by raising your virtual hand in the chat. Now I have the great pleasure to introduce Sjoukje Van Der Meulen, who served as Rudolf Arnheim guest professor at our institute during the fall semester of 2020 and 2021. Sjoukje Van Der Meulen received her MA and PhD degrees from Columbia University's Department of Art and History and the School of Architecture, respectively. She has taught at Columbia University, the University of Illinois, Chicago, and the University of Oregon, and was a lecturer at the Media Studies Department of the University of Amsterdam. Currently, she is Professor of Modern and Contemporary Art at Utrecht University. For her scholarly work, Sjoukje has been awarded numerous prizes, most recently with the Aspasia Fellowship for Female Scientists from her home university, Utrecht University. Sjoukje pursues three major research topics in her scholarship, on which she publishes regularly in international journals and publications. One are questions of globalization, which she tackles specifically with an eye to developments in Chinese contemporary art. Her article on Wan Bing's portrayal of migrant workers in the China garment industry, for example, will appear in the journal Pacific Affairs in June this year. A second scholarly focus of hers is on the relationship between media art and digital culture. Sjoukje unpacks this relationship by offering in-depth critical analysis of fundamental philosophers of new media and putting their concepts and terms in contact with contemporary artistic practices. In the article Man as Aggregate of Data, What Computers Shouldn't Do from 2019, which Sjoukje co-published with Max Brunsma, she refers to the philosopher Hubert Dreyfus to discuss the implications of an increasingly data-driven society for contemporary conceptualizations of subjectivity and authenticity. Her much-read article on Willem Flusser's media theory, which was published in the journal New German Critique in 2010, positions the philosopher's work in relation to the media theorists Walter Benjamin and Marshall McLuhan. Both of these publications are also evidence of the fact that Sjoukje regularly acts as an important intermediary between European and US-American contexts of scholarship, introducing important theoretical frameworks as well as artistic developments to the respective communities on both sides of the Atlantic. Sjoukje's third research focus concerns contemporary art in Europe since the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. And the topic of democracy, as you probably heard from me describing her two other research foci, is clearly also conceptually on her mind. Today's lecture adheres to this large and ongoing research project, of course, which Sjoukje pursued during her stay in Berlin last fall as well. Sjoukje's presence in Berlin coincided with at least two events that highlight the topicality and urgency of her scholarship. One was the British withdrawal from the European Union, the preliminary endpoint to a prolonged and painful court clamping, which had started with the country's referendum in favor of leaving the EU in 2016. The second, of course, was the outbreak of a global pandemic, which necessitated a rapid and unprecedented restriction of civil liberties that had been so self-evident for a majority of citizens of the European Union that their sudden limitation came as a major and destabilizing shock. The Brexit demonstrated the uncomfortable fact that the European Union, despite its 30-year history, is no stable entity. The constant and urgent need to communicate the EU's functions to its member states and to justify its existence and its vision for a shared European future once again became blatantly obvious. The broad and ongoing restrictions of civil liberties as a consequence of the dynamic development of the pandemic demonstrated how precarious and preliminary the supposedly secure parameters of liberal democracy really are. Quickly, the fear of the pandemic was co-opted by increasingly autocratic governments of member states of the EU to justify fundamental and open-ended curtailments of civil rights. Just as quickly, narratives of such apparent curtailments were utilized by anti-democratic and anti-European groups to categorically challenge and dismiss democratic structures of decision-making. Both the EU and the idea of democracy that had been a vital part of its image and imagination since its conceptualization in 1992 are today then in dire need of critical support. For Sjoukje, contemporary art can act as such a catalyst. Her Knights of Democracy do not come to rescue the EU with drawn sword and unwavering chivalry, however. Rather, they accompany, reflect, and criticize the project called European Union from different, localized, and often contradictory perspectives on cultural histories and narratives. Sjoukje's examination of their diverse artistic practices offers a history of changing imaginations and evaluations of the EU. It also offers a hopeful glimpse at a future EU, where the differentiation between East and West, an ideological remnant from the Cold War, is finally laid to rest in the face of the region's global geopolitical repositioning. And where the challenge to describe what a European identity, European democracy, or European contemporary art may be, is addressed by a self-reflective, multi-voiced, and integrative European citizenship. Shaoqi Van Der Meulen has high hopes for the European Union. Her political work as chair of the European Group for the Dutch Social Democratic Party, for which she organized conferences and workshops on topics such as the future of the Eurozone and the migration crisis, attests to this. And she has high hopes for art as well. So please join me in welcoming Shaoqi Van Der Meulen. We very much look forward to her lecture titled Themes in Contemporary European Art, Nights of Democracy.
First of all, a thank you to Professor Schuster and Professor Eninger for these wonderful introductions. Ich möchte auch die Gelegenheit jetzt nutzen, selber einige Instituten und Stiftungen für die enorme Unterstützung und Gastfreundlichkeit während meiner Rudolf Arnheim Gastprofessur zu bedanken. Zuerst mal natürlich die Humboldt Universität und das Institut für Kunst und Bildgeschichte, dann auch das Max-Liebermann-Haus und Staff, Brandenburg, die Stiftung Brandenburger Tor und nicht zu vergessen die AAD und die Preußische Kulturstiftung. Danke vielmals. Ich habe eine sehr gute und produktive Zeit gehabt in Berlin und ich hoffe, dass ich werde jetzt etwas von dieser Arbeit heute zeigen können. The Max Liebermann House, next to the Brandenburger Tor, seems the right place to give a lecture on art and democracy in the European Union. Not only does the Kulturstiftung Brandenburger Tor take democracy and culture as guiding principle for its programming, strengthening democracy through culture, but the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany are commonly seen as preconditions for the founding of the European Union. In Passage to Europe, How a Continent Became a Union, political theorist Luc van Middelaar identifies the collapse of the wall as an epochmachende Ereignis, and he adds that we have only just begun to assess its significance. But as important as this historical event was, I will take the consequence, or formalization, if you will, of this moment, 1992, the founding of the European Union, as my starting point. The year 1989 always somehow forces you back towards the past, to the post-war period, the 20th century, whereas 1992 indicates that you want to focus on the current state of the European Union into the 21st century. Oh, can I stop this? First, I would like to show you an excerpt from a documentary with street interviews conducted by American artist Shelley Silver in Berlin. Portraying the city just a few years after the Wende, she interrogates East and West Berliners about this historical event and the major themes that were relevant at the time, such as reunification, German history, nation, and democracy. It is, of course, a pity to be able to show only a 2-minute excerpt from the section on democracy, but I simply want to encourage you to think with me about the concept of democracy almost 30 years after the fall of the wall, following in the footsteps of Berliners in this film who share their fresh experiences and opinions against the urban backdrop of a Berlin under construction. Although this lecture focuses on European artists, I make an exception for Silver because she shot this time document at this critical juncture in the history of Germany and a burgeoning European democracy.
Ich glaube, wir haben hier die beste Demokratie, die es auf der Welt geben kann, glaube ich, weil ich wüsste jetzt kein besseres Beispiel, wo es demokratischer zugeht.
Ich halte den deutschen Staat an sich in seiner Grundform für mit das Beste, was wir in Europa haben.
Das Volk kann doch im Grunde genommen das sagen und tun, was es möchte. Okay, ob wir nun zufrieden sind mit unseren Politikern oder nicht, aber wir sind eine Demokratie, doch, ja.
Wenn man Demokratie nicht idealisiert, sondern sie mal realistisch betrachtet, dann glaube ich, dass die Bundesrepublik ein demokratischer Staat ist, ja.
Demokratie ist ein Wort, das auf dem Papier steht, sowohl im ehemaligen Sozialismus als auch in der Bundesrepublik. Da wird zwar viel drüber geredet und die hauen sich gegenseitig die Ohren vom Stamm, auch im Bundestag, aber in Wahrheit gibt es das nicht. Volksherrschaft ist eine Erfindung hoher Herren, um die Massen zu beruhigen.
Auf keinen Fall. Der ist nicht demokratisch. Und wenn man irgendwie weiter guckt, Jerry Lee, wenn man irgendwie weiter guckt, ich meine, wo gibt es denn eine richtige Demokratie? Wer kann das überhaupt auseinanderhalten? Was ist Demokratie? Wer weiß das genau?
Ja, zu demokratisch. Wir kommen aufs gleiche Thema, nicht? Indem man jeden, ich will nicht sagen abschrauben, das ist vielleicht zu hart ausgedrückt, aber jeden Menschen reinlässt, ist meines Erachtens so die Angst gewesen, dass wir den Krieg verloren haben, ja, schlimm, dass wir angefangen haben. Nur aus Angst, dass man nun wieder als narzisstischer Staat sehen soll oder Polizeistaat, wie es im Osten war, heißt es, alles kommt her.
Ich würde Demokratie immer so formulieren, welche Demokratie meinst du, deine oder meine? Es gibt meines Erachtens viele Formen von Demokratie, genauso wie Freiheit. Freiheit, die ich meine, welche meinst du, sprich deine oder meine? Darum handelt es sich. So würde ich das sehen. Es ist immer irgendwie objektiv auf eine bestimmte Sache auch bezogen. Eine absolute Demokratie, würde ich sagen, gibt es nicht.
Silver's documentary approach is democratic in design. First, because the film was predominantly shot in public spaces, and second, because the artist gives voice to ordinary Berlin citizens. The artist interviewed a broad spectrum of people, traveling from keys to keys by U and S-Bahn to ensure, I quote, the widest bouquet of answers possible. What is intriguing is that the respondents collectively mention almost all of the democratic issues that are still prevalent in the European Union today. The doubts about an ideal democracy, questions about freedom of speech, the role of foreigners, and the question of definition to begin with. Towards the end, the self-conscious woman asks the key rhetorical question, whose democracy do you mean? I don't want to discuss who comes from East or West Berlin, because this kind of labeling is against the artist's intention, and such rhetoric is also outdated. But there seems to be an almost unbridgeable gap between the two boys' belief in the best democracy, namely theirs, and that of the skeptical girl who is convinced that democracy is invented by Hohenheim. Silver's film is credited in the anthology of Former West, a group of scholars, critics, curators, and artists affiliated with a long-term project examining East-West relationships through a shared critical question at the time. I quote, "The so-called West has continued to think and act symbolically and realistically as first among what were supposed to have become equal. One wonders precisely why then, when there is a former East, there is no former West." Former West addressed this by now totally recognized imbalance in response to another key moment in the EU's short history, its expansion into East and Central Europe from 2004 to 2007. One of the central debates in the European Union today is a new or revived East-West divide, especially with regard to democracy. This raises the question of whether the EU is indeed a constellation of member states with many fault lines that elude simple geographical categorization, or whether the gap between Eastern and Western Europe, if we can still use these Cold War terms, has broadened and become one of the main challenges for EU cohesion, or perhaps a combination of both. The Maastricht Treaty is considered the birth certificate of the European Union, which is important because it thus frames democracy as we know it today. As is well known, the treaty defined the Union mainly in economic terms, while the political union did not really get off the ground, apart from general statements about democracy as the political model of the Union, or as it is written in the treaty, I quote, "Adherence to the principles of liberty, democracy, and respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms of the rule of law." Historically important for a democratic perspective remains the introduction of common European citizenship. But more detailed questions relevant to this newly formed democracy, such as what powers the member states should transfer to the Union, what is needed to preserve the sovereignty of the member states, and what minimum requirements of democracy the EU itself should meet, were not addressed. And the main institutions, the European Council, Commission, and Parliament, were still fraught with democratic flaws, even if the treaty promised to, I quote, "further develop the democratic and efficient functioning of the institutions." Now, you might wonder why I'm talking about this Maastricht Treaty so long, but for me, it was a kind of eye-opening to go through actually the document. You see how, it's an enormous volume. And when you go through it, you really have to look for democracy or anything related to it. It's really a document about the economy. So almost embarrassingly so. The focus in this lecture is on art in a number of countries that tend to see themselves as models of democracy, such as Germany, the Netherlands, and France, and member states that have less of a democratic history and are experiencing conflicts with the EU on democracy, especially Hungary and Poland. On this map, I indicated which countries I will discuss today: Germany, the Netherlands, Poland, Hungary, France, Greece, Serbia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, in that order. The latter two are, of course, not EU member states, although they have been in the waiting room, so to speak, for quite some time. I will not only address artists who take democracy as their subject matter, but also artists whose work provides insight into the historical or political situation in a particular member state, which may shed light on a different perspective on democracy. All this with the aim of bringing democratic conflicts in the EU closer and illuminating them, making them tangible in a sense through art. Publicist Roger de Weck summarizes these different perspectives of today's European democracy in his recent book of 2020, The Power of Democracy, Die Kraft der Demokratie. I quote, "In East, West, South and North," and he is talking about the European Union here, "every democracy is different. Democracy is a basic pattern that has never been identical in two nations. The checks and balances between the three state powers have been designed differently in each country, depending on national tradition and history, the culture of conflict or compromise, the sense of citizenship, the ability to read and perceive the state, the wisdom of the constitution makers," end quote. What he means is basically that Germany has a Verhandlungsdemokratie, France has a centralized democracy, and East and Central European countries, for example, whose history was barely or briefly democratic, quote, imitated the model of liberal democracy rather than internalizing it. Before I turn to art, a word on the knight of democracy. The figure of the knight, as I mobilize it, is a political variant of Rosalind Krause's use of the term in her book On the Blue Cup, where it refers to artists defending the specific aesthetic medium in the age of the media. Originally, a knight is a medieval nobleman who serves and defends his sovereign or lord, preferably mounted on a white horse and in shining armor. Knights of democracy thus defend the values of a political system based on equal representation, the rule of law, freedom of speech, and the respect for human rights. But what I also find interesting about the figure of the knight is that the antonym is the civilian, the commoner, a figure who does not fight, at least not by armed means. The strengthening of civil society, the commons, including art and culture, is often seen as a peaceful and constructive way to bolster democracy. A model example of a knight fighting with artistic means is Wolfgang Tillmans, the German photographer whose anti-Brexit campaign can be seen as a noble and combative defense of democracy as it has taken shape since the creation of the European Union and long before. Here are some examples from Tillmans' poster series with aphorisms pricing the European peace project on the left, European democracy in the middle, and a call for solidarity to defend democratic values in a member state where democracy is under threat, such as Poland. The question is whether Tillmans' posters communicate to a wider audience that is beyond an art world accustomed to enjoying a minimalist aesthetic with no significant visual imagery other than a somewhat cliched, colossal, flapping blue EU flag. Still, it is a bold concept and a courageous move in an attempt to lead by example and take a stand as a well-known figure in the cultural fields. My next knight is Jonas Staal, a politically engaged Dutch artist who is currently active around the world, but who has also done a number of projects related to the European Union, for example, in Greece and Poland. This slide shows Staal's project in a theater in Warsaw titled Unionizing the Polish Parliament from 2018. When the Law and Justice Party came back to power in 2015, the independence of the judiciary, as we all know, and the media have been undermined by new laws and regulations in violation of core democratic values of the European Union. At the height of this conflict between Poland and the European Union, when Frans Timmermans, first Vice President of the European Commission, activated Article 7.1, Staal created his alternative Polish parliament, to which he invited cultural organizations and minority groups who fought against or were cornered by the new legislation. In Staal's words, quote, "A two-day assembly with the aim to organize the creative field against the increasing repression and censorship of the law and justice-led government," end quote. Staal's installation mimics the circular design of the actual Polish parliament. but with a few notable differences. First, in Stahl's version, the central speaker's chair is multiplied to 4, one in each corner, to encourage public debate rather than monological speeches, as dialogue is at the heart of democratic society. Using imagery inspired by the iconic activist poster Beat the Whites with the Right Wedge by Russian avant-gardist L. Lissitzky, the Polish red and white flag is undergoing a metamorphosis into a contemporary avant-gardist symbol for a new union. For Stahl, this is not only a message to Poland, but also to the EU. I quote, "This new union represents transnational solidarity with cultural workers and women's organizations in Poland, but also sets a new political horizon for the European continent." In the 1960s, the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas argued that the democratic society stands or fails on public debate, on issues of common concern that live in that society. Habermas' concepts of the public sphere, which he calls Öffentlichkeit, publicness, has been criticized for many quarters for being too elitist because it's based on an ideal conception of the public domain. In 1992, the year of the founding of the European Union, with which Habermas became very much involved, sometimes you feel like he's almost acting as the official philosopher of the Union, he acknowledged these shortcomings. What he had not considered, he confesses, was the possibility of, quote unquote, parallel public spheres. Thus, Habermas revises his idea of the public sphere to a more differentiated, a more pluralistic concept in which matters might be debated and opinions being formed outside the dominant discourse. These pluralistic voices and opinions should also not be seen as, quote unquote, passive echoes, but rather as, I quote, active counter-projects. Stahl's alternative parliament in the cultural domain relates to Habermas's revised concept of the public sphere. His project in Poland promotes counter-projects and dissenting voices in a society where the public domain is increasingly constrained. Stahl can be seen as a knight of democracy, not so much because he defends EU values, as Tillmans does. Stahl, in fact, is quite critical of the EU's technocratic interpretation of democracy, which he says lacks imagination, but because he feels called to promote principled and uncompromising democratic values. A very different approach to Poland's struggling democracy comes from Polish artist Artur Siemiecki, who co-curated the 7th Berlin Biennale in 2012, where art was presented as a form of political activism, or rather forms of political activism. In this somewhat earlier work from 2007, he asks Polish citizens from different social groups to define their identity. These groups, the all Polish youth, young socialists, Jewish youth, and a group of women of the Orthodox Church were invited to create an artwork that they felt represented their group, all working together in one indoor space. Then is the apt title of this participatory project, since each of these groups excludes the others. I'll show you the opening part of the video to give you a sense of the atmosphere.
Studiuję matematykę na pierwszym roku na Uniwersytecie Kapelańskim pana Wyszyńskiego. Oprócz matematyki interesuję się jeszcze informatyką.
Oprócz działalności Młodzieży Wszechpolskiej od 10 lat należy do Związku Harcerstwa Rzeczypospolitej.
Chciałam Młodzieży Wszechpolskiej. Tyle.
Polin. Nie, napiszemy Polin, to nie jest zły pomysł. No, czyli, że tu spoczniemy, prawda? Takie jest tłumaczenie. Tak? Nazwa polska po hebrajsku.
Jestem działaczką takiej organizacji Ponton. Zajmujemy się głównie edukacją, ale edukacją seksualną w szkołach.
Formalnie jestem w Komitecie Pomocy i Obrony Represjonowanych Pracowników i w Grupie na Rzecz Partii Robotniczej.
Jestem członkinią Młodych Socjalistów. Co prawda już nie taka młoda, jestem działaczką seniorem. Więc wydaje mi się, że na naszym obrazku powinniśmy pokazać to, że uważamy wszystkich za równych względem siebie.
As you could see, everything starts very peacefully. Each group creates a symbol that they feel reflects their identity. The women paint an Orthodox church in Chagall style. I don't think it was in the clip. All Polish youth paint the nationalist ceremonial sword. The Jewish youth write Poland in Hebrew, and the young socialists paint the word freedom. In the second session, the participants are invited to respond to each other's artworks without any restrictions. They begin again respectfully, changing only a few details. Someone takes a pair of scissors and opens the doors of the church. However, things quickly deteriorate, and in the final session, all dialogue between the groups has disappeared and iconoclastic behavior takes over. Works by the others, by them, are completely repainted, destroyed, and finally even burned down. The video ends with an empty room in which there is not a single artwork left, only remnants scattered on the floor. Siemieszki's project can be understood by the concept of a not yet fully realized democracy, as proposed by Polish art historian Piotr Piotrowski. Piotrowski links his idea of unfulfilled democracy, that's the term that he uses, to East and Central Europe, although he indicates that on a deeper political philosophical level, a democracy is of course unrealized by definition. I quote, "There isn't and there will never be an ideal democracy. Democracy is a real, not an ideal political system. It always has faults, but there are also always ideas for how it can be improved. What is important is that those ideas increase democracy and do not replace it with an authoritarian democracy," end quote. In recent years, however, democracy has precisely been moving in the authoritarian direction feared by Piotrowski. Siemieszki's approach reveals the deeper polarization in Polish society that brews under the fragile layer of an unfulfilled democracy, whereby the artist is more interested in reenacting political reality than in straightforward activism. I quote, "In art that opens up a space where politics can be performed." Oh. A documentary filmmaker who is also portraying polarization in Poland is Grzegorz Paprzycki. The director took to the streets to film demonstrations and protests by radical right and leftist groups. I'll show you part of the film in the background. The latent aggression in society is very tangible in the film, in the constant sense of threat that the demonstration can derail into violence. The technique Paprisky deploys to build up these tensions is cross-cutting. He juxtaposes images and behaviors of far-right and far-left groups that eventually converge, or rather collide, in public spaces, such as a university auditorium or an urban square. The scene in the church that you have just seen, I believe, forms a climax where skinheads are singing Christmas carols during Mass while waving their banners with nationalist symbols and anti-Semitic texts. In such and other disturbing scenes, the title of the film acquires a grim undertone, My Country, So Beautiful. Now, Paprisky told me that, when he started this project, he, of course, he doesn't want to communicate this is every day going on in Poland. But at the same time, after a year of filming, he did realize that it is a very present reality, even more so than he thought. According to Brian Porter's Suits, the knight is a recurring figure in modern Polish history, even an archetype. Since the end of the 18th century, the struggle for freedom, independence, and the quest for democracy has repeatedly flared up and failed. He also assigns artists a role in this history, I quote, novelists, poets, and historians telling the story of the nation as if it were a collective agent fighting for its existence, only to fail gallantly each time. Paprisky and Siemiewski can be seen in this light because they are narrators rather than activists. They tell or visualize the story of radical groups in Polish society, some of whom indeed behave as if the survival of their nation is at stake. If one compares the work of the Polish artist with that of Staal, a typical product of Dutch Calvinist preacher culture, and Tillmans, a well-meaning German who is going to teach the British a lesson in democracy or save the Polish people, the East and Central Europeans are less paternalistic, or conversely, the West Europeans still point this finger more at other people's countries, while the Polish artists seem to prefer to show things that are not going so well in our own country without that same judging and moralizing. Another country in conflict with the European Union when it comes to democracy is Hungary. In 2014, Orbán presented his dissenting vision of democracy with the term the liberal state, ostensibly to preserve Hungary's national sovereignty and protect its Judeo-Christian traditions from the grip of the European Union. In doing so, he is creating what political scientists have called a hybrid democracy, a political model somewhere in the gray zone between democracy and dictatorship, which reached a new phase in March 2020, which you see here on the slide, when Orbán used the corona crisis to seize power by declaring a state of emergency with no end date in sight. One artist who, for me, illuminates Hungary's political history in relation to the contemporary situation is Balázs Kicsinyi, an artist born in 1958 who lived through the communist period and witnessed the 1989 revolution firsthand. The image on the left shows the props of this installation. The clock goes around, a pair of gloves, a sponge, a plastic sink with a kitchen clock, and another clock in a draining rack. The installation is also the setting for a performance in which the props are placed on simple folding tables arranged in a circle, and behind each table is a cleaning lady who cleans the clocks. The clocks are passed around, so when one woman finishes cleaning one clock, she puts it in the draining rack ready for the next cleaning woman. The clocks literally go around. The installation is inspired by Orson Welles' film The Stranger from 1946 and a ballad by a 19th century Hungarian poet, János Arany. These works tell about a crime committed by someone who tries to erase that crime. In the film, a war criminal, and in the poem, a woman who murdered her husband in bed. The protagonist in Welles' films becomes obsessed with clocks, while the woman in the poem cannot stop washing sheets in the river, and both continue until death or insanity follows. But even without knowing these artistic sources of inspiration, the viewer senses that something is not right here, because why would one try and wash away time? The installation and performance were first shown in a bank, and you just saw the performance in a bank, in Budapest, where the link to money whitewashing is easy to make, especially at the time when capitalism was beginning to gain a foothold in Hungary. The second time the work was exhibited in a religious building with a large fresco on the wall that glorifies Hungarian history. Here, the endless process of cleaning clocks, and there is no image of this work, I don't have it at least, the endless process of cleaning clocks functioned more as a critical reminder of the whitewashing of history, a phenomenon not uncommon to Hungarian history. Although Kicini's work is primarily a poetic philosophical reflection on the complexities, absurdities, and cruelties of time, the women are a cog in a regulated and dehumanized production chain, and you really don't need to know anything about Hungarian history. The history does inform the work and adds an extra layer of meaning. The reason for discussing the work in depth is that it generates insight in how a cyclical experience of time and history can lead to a more skeptical attitude towards perhaps the next power that presents itself as a norm. Already in 2004, Piaget heavily criticized this supposedly necessary dialectical process towards normalization, which, as Kicini's work shows, seems totally set up for failure, at least in a Hungarian context. To quote Piaget, after Eastern Europe was liberated at the end of the 1980s, the period of transition was more often than not referred to as normalization. But were we really to recognize this transformation as normalization, we must notice today, at the end of the 1990s, the process of normal is over. Lessons in democracy have started to show results, and not all of them are good. Another of Kicini's works in the same series on time that he worked on from 2005 to 2009, called The Time of the Burial, evokes a concept of another theorist, namely Boris Groys, his post-communist condition, or the idea that communism may have been defeated, but that does not mean that it has disappeared, that it no longer leaves traces or conditions contemporary society. Before elaborating on this work, I would like first to show you a clip of this most unusual burial. Here is a drawing of the video we just have seen, showing a burial that again conjures up layers of interwoven historical, political, and philosophical meaning. For those who recognize Budapest National Cemetery, the meaning moves from a mere philosophical contemplation on time to a more precise political, historical question. Who is buried here? Historical time, a political regime perhaps, or a specific person? A few meters away is the grave of the communist leader János Kadar, who ruled communist Hungary from 1956 to 1989. The video was made just after Kadar's skull was stolen, given the work and edge that evokes the post-communist trace in Geuss's sense. But according to Kiccini, the phenomenon of reburial goes much deeper than just the communist past. Hungary's history is full of reburials. There are examples from the Habsburg Empire, the Stalin period, the Hungarian Revolution, of course. In Kiccini's words, I quote, "It's almost a tragic comedy. When you are buried in Hungary, you are never quite sure if this is the last time. When the past is constantly being reinvented, you are very uncertain when something truly belongs to the past. How can you plan for the future when the past is so taboo or so much a fiction?" End quote. It is precisely this uncertainty, in the sense that history never seems to be truly buried, but always can resurface in the present and shape the future, which confirms Geuss's idea that the past conditions the present reality and also provides insight, I think, into Hungary's EU skepticism. Political scientist Philip Manov addresses the most current challenges to democracy, such as in Poland and Hungary. Manov assumes that, I quote, "every principle of rule carries its counter-principle in the discourse of legitimation, like a negative. Democracy justifies itself against an imagined non-democracy. This non-democracy, or what Manov calls also the endangerment discourse, discourse, used to be, of course, communism. But since there is no such external dystopia anymore, since the end of the Cold War, the enemy might develop from within, because the negative remains a condition for the credibility of the system. Furthermore, Manov describes democracy as a quote-unquote system of organized uncertainty, where the uncertainty refers to the fact that we can never know for sure whether we are in a democracy or not, since the status of democracy depends on the consent of the loser, which we will not know until the next election. And Hungarians, as Kiccini shows in his videos, know from experience how such uncertainty works and feels. The strength of Manov's theory is that what he describes as the de-democratization process and Demokratisierungsprozess is no longer all too easily applicable to so-called problem countries, but a systemic problem that threatens democracy as such. The approach to Kiccini's work, the approach of Kiccini's work differs enormously from the large-scale participatory projects of GR, a French artist and photographer whose work is dedicated to the democratic cause, including current concerns about inclusiveness and diversity, taking full advantage of the potential of public space, which he calls the quote-unquote largest art gallery in the world. In his TED talk, the artist made his social activist or artivist, that's a term of GR, vision explicit. I quote, stand up for what you care about by participate in this global project to change the world, end quote. This is one version here in the image of GR's long-term inside-out project carried out in Wuppertal, Germany. The entire building was covered with 700 portraits with different faces from people of all walks of life. This diversity was exactly what the artist was aiming for, putting forward a cross-section of the Wuppertaler population, who together were to represent a tolerant society. Or as GR stated, we want to bring people of different ethnic origin, religion, gender, or sexual orientation together. We want people to see people beyond the differences. Oh, I have to go back. The question of how art can be politically and socially relevant has a specific interest for Jacques Rancière, a French philosopher who has dealt extensively with the intersection of politics and aesthetics. One condition that such art must meet for Rancière is sufficient distance from the art world. GR project easily meets this first requirement. Moreover, socially engaged art can only be effective for Rancière if the distance between the work and the viewer is reduced, which de facto means that the viewer becomes a participant. This is a condition that GR's project also meets with ease, including an awareness of the power that comes from having access to one's own representation. And Rancière says about that, emancipation begins when we challenge the opposition between viewing and acting, and also understand the structure of domination and subjection behind that. I would argue that the driving force behind GR's work is closely tied to a fundamental democratic concept born in the French Revolution, namely the sovereignty of the people. That this is not a far-fetched idea can be shown by GR's Grand Projet at the Panthéon in Paris, where French heroes are buried, including major figures of the French Revolution, such as Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau, of course, is the inventor of the social contract, which is based on the idea of the need for cooperation in society. While an art project cannot be compared to a politically agreed upon social contract, GR does appeal to a similar sense of cooperation of like-minded people for a higher purpose, a collective good. The message in this work is clear. People, we the people, are heroes. In GR's words, steeped in democratic ideals. I quote, "Everyday people from all over France have now joined, if only temporarily, the Panthéon of the famous men and women who have shaped their country's history and future." Although GR's projects inspired thousands of people around the world, a critical reflection from my European perspective is in order. This despite the fact that the artist in all respects meets the conditions of Rancière's theories for effective socially and politically engaged art as formulated by the philosopher in his key work De Sensus and other books. Before substantiating this criticism, however, I want to first show you about 4 minutes of GR's project. In the clip, which can be seen in its entirety on GR's website, and it's really worth it, I think, you will get a sense of how GR and his team work and how the project connects to Rancière's concept of the senses, or, I quote, the essential reconfiguration of the common experience.
We are in a country where for more than 50 years, you had a single portrait in the streets, the portrait of the ruler.
We can have a look actually at a small face that you see on the building there. Part of the project is that we will be replacing this face by faces of Tunisians.
They were always seeing pictures of all the presidents and all the dictators that we had in Tunisia. Now, I mean, the message would be like, oh, it's not that anymore. It's people, it's Tunisians, it's us.
Just 2 seconds. There is a girl who has a nice face. If she takes the same way of us, I follow her. Okay, go there. La première journée, j'étais assez tendu et je n'ai pas pu avoir un portrait. J'ai abordé une quinzaine de personnes. J'ai visité 3 quartiers Et toutes les personnes que j'ai croisées ont dit non, pas de portrait. Mais une fois que c'est lancé, ça, on n'arrête plus en fait.
So we have the chance to shoot our own photography and be part of this huge project. We have to shoot people in the streets that we don't know, and to play with them, to share what you feel. This is a challenge. Want to see this one? It's good, no?
Aslan, je suis photographe. On est en train de faire 100 portraits de Tunisiens. Est-ce que ça vous intéresse? Ça prend 3 minutes de faire un portrait.
We took pictures of everybody, and we had to talk to people and to listen to them and to listen to their stories. And it's great because you see how people are and how they really are. And we met really amazing people, not nice, but amazing people.
That would be a project led by local people, done by local artists, posted by local volunteers, and have the know-how that was built by JR and the ideas that were nurtured with the whole team being brought and shared with other people.
T'es content du... Ouais, je suis super content. Bah ça, ce qui est génial, c'est que vous avez exactement capté. Finalement, c'est un mix de travail vraiment professionnel et amateur, mais c'est ce que je cherchais, quoi. C'est ce que j'avais espéré qu'il se passe, quoi. C'est-à-dire vraiment que ce soit vos photos. Et c'est juste, on essaie de mettre une règle pour le projet, que ce soit des portraits et qu'il y ait quelque chose qui se dégage. Et là, on l'avait dans tous les portraits. Il y avait à chaque fois un rire, une expression.
De toute façon, il y avait à chaque fois une émotion.
Exactement.
Un contact humain extraordinaire. Hein.
Ah, c'est cool. Bah, surtout, vous êtes les premiers.
Inside Out, Autocracy in Tunisia, is a grand projet in the name of democracy, a very timely response to events in Tunisia. But the project does raise post-colonial questions about European democracy's seemingly never-ending quest to spread, or at least promote, itself to its African neighbors, Tunisia being a former colony of France. Is a French artist, even of Tunisian descent, the appropriate knight to lead the visual reform in the country, even in collaboration with the local people? In A Nation Torn, Hannah Feldman explains with respect to neighboring Algeria how its people were rendered invisible for decades. GR certainly tries to make visible the people who have been oppressed for many years, but he does not seem to look much beyond current events, does not take into account the complex decolonization process or his role as a French artist and knight of democracy in it. I bring up this post-colonial critique to suggest that in addition to the democratic questions of the East-West divide that have been the focus of the lecture here, there are a host of other questions about democracy related to the European Union. In addition to questions about the contemporary impact of the colonial legacy, there is the question of the compatibility of democracy and Islam in Europe, or European Islam, and the violation of sovereignty of Southern European member states during the Euro crisis. The last documenta in 2007, which took place in both Athens and Kassel, looked critically at the financial crisis in Greece and Southern Europe. In the words of the artistic director, I quote, but you see it also on the slide, "The austerity measures imposed in successive phases by the international financial institutions in concert with leaders of the European Union resulted in a de facto loss of sovereignty of the current and any future Greek political electorate." The relationship between Greece and Germany and also the European Union was problematized in Roger Bernhardt and Roberto Frattini's participatory theatrical project, The Place of the Thing, 2017, so that was on the documenta. At the heart of the project is the seemingly strange connection between an oath stone present at the trial of Socrates and the German fascist idea of the Thingspiel and the Thingplatz, inspired by the old Germanic use of a circular site with stones and a Greek amphitheater. In the video, we see the journey of this unusual stone. It's a copy, actually, a fake, from the Greek mountains near Athens to Kassel, choreographed by the various participatory art groups. It travels past the Greek parliaments, and you see all of this in the picture, ends up in a court case decided by third-grade school children, hitchhikes on the Greek highway, and encounters problems at the border where, as a cultural treasure, it tries to get out of the country with one of the shipping containers. And rather humorous, but also opaque and uncanny modern Thingspiel, I mean, the Thingspiel is uncanny to begin with, in which contemporary democracy is at stake. Yanis Varoufakis refers to the toxic privilege he had as a finance minister to sign a piece of paper that would put, I quote, Greece further into its labyrinthine jail of debt. An analogy to Socrates' poison cup and the oath stone. Varoufakis, by the way, did not sign. This is the final installation in Kassel. You see it's just a documentary material. Philosopher Slavoj Žižek also reflected on the status of the European Union at the time of the Greek crisis. In 2013, he co-published a book with the thought-provoking Freudian title, What Does Europe Want? The Union and its Discontents. The title refers to Sigmund Freud's famous quote, Was will das Weib? Which alone speaks volumes about the supposed elusiveness of the EU, at least according to the authors. As you can read in this quote, one of the themes in this book is European democracy, which Žižek problematizes using the Hegelian notion of, quote, oppositional determination. Suspending democracy to defend democracy is an example of oppositional determinism, which the EU implicitly invokes in the conflict with Greece. First get the finances in order, then we'll talk about democracy and sovereignty. Thus, to get Greece back on track and the EU out of the crisis, it had to comply with the financial measures imposed by the EU, or the Troika, which for the Greeks, however, meant losing control of their own country. Žižek's concept of oppositional determinism, determination, also helps to understand the performance Spinal Discipline by Irena Hajduk, featuring women in elegant Greek-style gowns who are forced to walk upright as they balance a book on their heads. Hajduk's work is a very complex work, which I definitely won't do justice in this talk. Hajduk's work is part of an art project that revives the production lines of a former Yugoslav company called Yugo Export. In re-establishing this company, the artist states that she is trying to counter, quote, this zombification of the former Yugoslavia, which links the work to Groys's concepts of postcommunism. In my reading of the work, the performance alludes to the balancing act that countries of the Western Balkans must endure in order to transform themselves into a capitalist democracy. Oppositional determinism operates on many levels in this work. In the contrast between the disciplinary shoes and the free-floating gowns, the open shoes and the closed books, and underlying all of this, the almost impossible, if not paradoxical, balance sought between two completely different political and economic systems. Although this army of beautiful women, that's a phrase of Hajduk herself, are not the Joan Arc warrior type, it evokes the image of a female knight in the civilian sense described in this lecture. An important motivation for doing this research on democracy and art in the European Union since the Maastricht Treaty, which was the first official mention of European democracy as a prerequisite for the Union, is my observation that political and media positions dominating the public sphere in Europe are often hardened and cliched, especially if you take into account the very different historical and political contexts that form the basis of the EU. The consistent stigmatization of countries as problem countries or debt countries, for instance, simplifies and screens a political reality that is much more complex. Art, with its critical tradition and capacity for raising awareness on the one hand, and its expressive qualities that appeal to the senses and the imagination on the other, opens up different perspectives and insights than the political discourse inside and outside the media. The discourse on the relationship between aesthetics and politics has evolved enormously over the past 2 decades and has been nuanced by a wide range of theorists and philosophers, including some of those featured in this lecture, such as Boris Koijs and Jacques Rancière. This lecture dealt with a much smaller but very topical subject, namely how aesthetic and political issues related to democracy are mobilized or illuminated in the work of contemporary European artists. In this context, I have introduced the figure of the knight, which is not only deeply rooted in European history and mythology, but in combination with the term democracy, I hope, also triggers the imagination. Different types of knights have come to the fore. The moral knight, who heroically defends democratic values and ideals with artistic weapons, which is well represented somehow among Western European artists, such as Jonas Staal, Wolfgang Tillmans, and GR, the latter even on a grand missionary tour. At the other end of the spectrum, there is a very different kind of knight who acts in the background as an observer or guard, and rather creates or enters a political space to provoke or portray undemocratic forces boiling in society. The Polish artists Simiewski and Paprysky are good examples of this. In between are artists whose work is self-consciously informed by deep political and historical contexts. The work of Ticini, Bernat, and Hajduk shows that aesthetic theory alone is often not enough to understand the many fractures, asynchronies, and power conflicts in the context of a divided, or at least multifarious, democracy in the EU. Altogether, I think these artworks put forward and explore what we might call an aesthetics of democracy. I would like to end. I would like to go back to the last slide, if that's possible. I was looking for my slide. One earlier. Let me see. Yeah. I mean, you always should end with art, right? I would like to end with a work by Bosnian artist Smirna Kulinovic on the growing right-wing nationalist movements in Bosnia and Herzegovina. This plaque was put up in memory of convicted war criminal Ratko Mladic and depicts him as a hero. Kulinovic's simple but powerful intervention is the addition of a label that reads, "The European Union is deeply concerned." Kulinovic's use of the word concerned summarizes the paradoxes at work in this context. The EU says it cares deeply about Bosnia-Herzegovina's fledgling democracy, but at the same time has hopelessly failed in the Yugoslav wars and is concerned that Bosnia is not yet democratic enough to join the Union. The Western Balkans is seen by the EU as a problematic region, haunted by a persisting cliched image of war and violence, in which itself has not played an overly heroic role. The integration of the countries of the Western Balkans is therefore often seen as a prerequisite for the successful completion of the hitherto unfulfilled democracy of the European Union, launched in Maastricht back in 1992.
Sjoukje, thank you so much for this inspiring and dense talk. And I think what I found just masterful was how you combined your analysis of artworks with just as a detailed and specific analysis of their contexts, of their political, local, also ideological context that they were produced in. And with this kind of interweaving showed us the complexity and also the dynamics of, you know, what it means to imagine democracy within what has been called the European Union through the last 30 years. So thank you so much for this. I think there's a lot of room for thought and discussions, and I would like to ask our listeners to please join us in this discussion. You're welcome to raise your hand. I'd just like to clarify that we will not be able to show you with an image, so you will just be able to you know, give your voice and ask your question directly in this context. But maybe I have the privilege of asking the first question. I was, you know, fascinated by the term night, of course, because it, you know, it figures prominently in your thinking. And I was at the beginning a little bit skeptical because, of course, you know, it's a singular male aristocratic figure that, you know, comes to the fore to save das europäische Weib. So, of course, I was a little bit worried, you know, but then I went back actually to Krauss, because that's who we refer to. And I thought that's actually interesting because she prominently connects this back to the chess figure of the knight. And you know, makes the argument that this knight in chess is, you know, kind of a self-reflective figure who thinks through the rules of the game and is able to reflect on them, but at the same time is immersed in these rules. So has to, you know, kind of comply to the limitations of the game as well. And I thought that's really interesting to have this kind of, you know, master player. And does that kind of connect to these also artists' figures in your, you know, kind of grand scheme? Because that would also allow kind of a very critical and at the same time productive thinking of these figures of the artists that you have so interestingly discussed. Yeah.
Well, that's a very complicated question. I mean, of course, I can't beat Rosalind Krauss, right? I mean, so your discussion of the way in which she theorizes the night, or kind of gives it a foundation, makes me feel like, oh, I have to go back to that book, and I'm sure there's more to learn from it, and maybe integrate it into, or weave it into my own arguments. But yeah, I think, you know, I kind of turn it around from the aesthetics to the political, because her whole framework is, of course, about aesthetics and a very deeply aesthetic reasoning, and that's where she positions also this night. And so I'm moving away from that by taking that aesthetic into the political field, but I totally agree. I mean, you can, of course, use that theoretical framework of the night, as you say, like it's in a game of chess. I could probably flesh that out in this lecture more. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'll just check if we already have a raised hand. Do we, Herr Schiller? Not yet. Okay. Well, maybe an important point that you made also at the very end of your lecture was this question of what can an aesthetics of democracy be? And it's kind of a starting point of our conversation that we had earlier already. Where do we come from kind of an theoretical aesthetic framing of this question, or coming from looking at a number of artworks who clearly discuss what democratic structures, how they can be made tangible, I think was how you formulated it.
Yeah.
And I do think there's a lot of kind of common ground, specifically if you think about authors like Rancière, about making something tangible, making something sinnlich erfahrbar, sinnliche Teilhabe, central participation. So maybe would you like to talk about this a little more, where you see kind of the connecting points between theoretical aesthetics and the aesthetics that you have kind of fleshed out from the projects that you have been discussing?
Well, I mean, there's always this question about when do you need to theorize, right? You need to theorize in art if something comes up in the practice of contemporary art that kind of triggers a need for a theory. And so in this particular work that I've been doing, I've been starting from the ground and just looking at artists. And at a certain point, also in conversations with you, I started to realize, yes, but if you take them all together, there arises this question about the aesthetics of democracy, because there are so many different approaches to deal with democratic, ideas within the artworks that you might think about that question. So I would say that is kind of the follow-up, research that comes out of this. That some artists are really, as I showed, like the Western European artists are really kind of using these aesthetics or these aestheticization of politics, basically, to basically, as a constructive force in some sense. But the older artists a lot of older artists that I showed, they have more in common perhaps with what Hal Forster, a long time ago, I'm sorry to go back to the October group again, but Hal Forster, I mean, you must credit him for this idea of the anesthetic, the not aesthetic. And if you look at the Polish artists, I think they use rather aesthetic strategies that intersect with the anesthetic, showing the bare reality, showing not something beautiful, but really what is going on there in terms of the violence on the ground. So that is a very different kind of dealing with this aesthetics, I think, of democracy.
Well, I think, in a sense, if one understands the aesthetics more broadly as sensual experience rather than, a formal artistic aesthetic, and kind of the rules that come with that, I think there is a lot of kind of common ground there with regard to what, what would be an aesthetics of democracy kind of outside of art. So, like a desensual way of communication and a an idea of participation and an understanding, you know, that by means of dialogue or, you know, conversation, you arrive at something that's outside of both sides' ideas. So you arrive at something new. So that there, you know, there are these ideas of what aesthetics of democracy could be, and then they might become, you know, you might be able to focus on them through artworks or through artistic practices, I think. But on the other hand, I also feel that a number of the projects that you discussed, and you did so too, could be harshly criticized with regard to that. So I tend to criticize Smiewski for his, you know, kind of setup of these groups who, you know, he even says at some point, and I think you quoted him, "Let the game begin." So you could really kind of call this a theatrical setup of dissensus, and I'm not, you know, I feel one could really critically assess this as well.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, I chose to pick on GR more than on Smiewski in this lecture, but yeah, I mean, some of these artists, I mean, especially Smiewski, of course. There's also the criticism should be built into the analysis of the work. But I hope that also what came to the fore is that, I mean, I'm tending to also be a little bit critical on, you know, I have a lot of students in Utrecht and always Rancière. I don't know why, but it never stops, Jacques Rancière. And that's because he thinks about aesthetics and politics, and he does that in a very contemporary way. And I'm using Rancière in this lecture, but at the same time, I mean, what I try to demonstrate is that, okay, if you use Rancière to understand particular artworks, then you still don't get at the criticism of the work. And so somehow aesthetics or the aesthetic theory is not enough. And that was a kind of unexpected outcome, that you have to historicize that, you know, the interrelationship between theory and history, particular with a politically sensitive topic like the democracy here, is incredibly important. You know, otherwise it becomes like this spiel. And maybe that's the Smiewski thing, the spiel. And it shouldn't be a spiel because there's a lot at stake.
Yes, I like that. I think in the end it comes back to methodology, right? It's a methodological question that needs to be addressed. So let me see, Herr Schiller, do we have a? Okay, great. We have a question from the audience.
That is really nice. Max?
Your co-author. Hello.
My co-author, that's nice of him.
Yes. My question concerns your suggestion of mixed identities. Gérard, for instance, is a French-Tunisian artist. So he identifies with two cultures. On the other hand, you have the Polish artists that you mentioned who kind of shy away to, in their films, at least in the work that you showed, identify with either directly their own country or outright with European culture at large. So my question is, how do you see this notion of mixed identities in art as a potential inspiration for the debate on European democracy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, I guess. Of course, one of the frustrations that you have if you have to formulate one lecture out of 10 lectures that I designed for the lecture course for the Rudolf Arnheim professorship is that, you know, you have to make certain choices, and a lot of the complexity of the argument probably becomes clear in one such lecture where you have to focus more narrowly. But I mean, I intend to address the question of this double identity, but you also have the question of the outside identity, right? I mean, there's a lot of perhaps artists that relate to Europe, but not from within the Union, more from without. which is also a kind of double identity, in a very different lecture, which should be a separate chapter in a book that I'm preparing on the basis of this topic. So I hope you are satisfied with this answer, because I don't think I can go into depth of a complicated issue like that.
Well, I do think that it became very clear in your lecture that there's also an important dynamic at kind of in place, you know, of European artists in the European Union, or also dealing with topics that, you know, there's a move away from kind of this fixation on East-West differences or conflicts, and, you know, kind of situating the EU more broadly and more globally within its kind of position. And I think that has become quite clear, and it's a focus of your work in any case. So I think that's, I think it's really important and worthwhile.
Well, I do get the question often, like, why the European Union? I mean, we thought like we had done with that, right? I mean, we're in a global field. But to me, this kind of almost a ban to talk about art in the European Union. I mean, you don't have that with American art, you don't have that with African art, I mean, other continents, but somehow if you talk about the European Union, you become like an ideologue of the European Union, because you want to frame it like that. I mean, from the very beginning, there has been criticism about, why the European Union, why European art is as old as, and, you know, you get all these arguments. But I feel that in a contemporary situation, because the European Union is really conditioning us, and a lot of these issues come up that artists actually relate to, within that context, I feel it's really time to actually do that kind of investigation.
Well, and I think because it is such a preliminary construct, it makes it even more interesting to, you know, focus on the kind of means and processes of constructing or imagining it as the European Union.
Exactly.
So, yeah. But we have another question. I'm sorry. Should I just read it aloud? Yeah. Okay. I'll read this one aloud.
Eva Maria. Yeah.
Oh, first Eva Maria. Okay. Sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. Is it my turn?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Sjoukje, thank you so much for that interesting and very dense talk. I have a question which came to my mind in that bit of your talk where you focused on Poland. Because historically speaking, the history of democracy in Poland, one could say, is particularly entangled with Germany, of course. And I find this interesting considering the current debate. Some of it even call it a new Historikerstreit. About Germany's relation to democracy in a historical perspective, but also in its relation to what we mean when we speak about democracy today. And it's a very German debate, but at the same time, it affects also transnational stories. So I'm wondering what the perspective that you take from the point of view of the European Union. I find this really interesting, epistemically also, what this adds to such a debate, and also particularly as an art historian.
I couldn't understand your last few sentences.
So you have probably also followed this debate that has been very prominent over the last weeks and months. It's a historiographic debate about how we understand and define democracy for German history. So starting from the Kaiserreich through the Weimar Republic and then further on into the 20th century, and also in its dimension for today. So I'm wondering if you take that debate, which is a national one, but one that is also transnationally entangled, if you take that from the point of view of a European Union framework, like you do in your project, and also particularly as an art historian, related actually to one of those questions that Eva Eninger just asked. What does your perspective then add to this, to such a discussion on? Basically, my question is, how do you define democracy in transnational perspectives also?
Yeah. Yeah, transnational perspective. You know, I'm not sure whether one of the maybe I'm very cautious of jumping in the transnational perspective at this particular moment. I mean, there's so many issues. For example, you know, the whole, I mean, I was like afraid that someone would bring up in the questions, but East and West, come on, those terms, you know, like Poland and Hungary and maybe also Germany, they consider themselves more Central Europe, right? There's this whole discussion about Central Europe rather than East-West divides and things like that. So these geographical positions, they seem to switch all the time. But that's, I think that's why for this particular moment, I still are kind of mapping out more the debates of democracy that are operating within a more specific geographical context, for example, Poland, or for example, Germany. So I'm sure that doesn't really satisfy your question. Maybe you can.
No, I think I wouldn't have a good answer to this too, but I think, I mean, it's
kind of related to the question about the double identity, I think.
I think so too. Yeah.
So it needs to be addressed within the framework. But maybe my steps are a little smaller, and I first try to do justice because, for example, the global discourse, you know, there's always this jumping to the global discourse, whereas I feel we have to also maybe be able to jump back and make it a little smaller, especially with the European Union, because the geopolitical positions within the global field, like with emerging China, et cetera, becomes very, you know, maybe a kind of almost what Maloff says, an endangerment discourse. And therefore, I think that it's necessary to make it smaller rather than immediately trends. So I'm not ready to go there somehow, but.
I think that's totally fine to you know, again, I think it's a methodological decision also of one's own working process, right? And I do think, I mean, I thought the idea of the question is then how does one integrate these important kind of transnational dynamics, and maybe, yes, through identities, right? But yeah, I think I would like to ask maybe the last question from our...
Well, maybe what is interesting, because Eva, thank you for your question, first of all, but I think that the discourse of transnationality was already in the air with Piotrowski, all the authors that I have discussed, basically, Boris Goys, Piotrowski. So it is an ongoing discourse that hasn't really been thought through either yet, I think. You know, it deserves attention.
You might already have answered the last question with this last question, with this last sentence. I'm reading it to you. Yeah. You are showing very interesting examples of European artists that are being connected to the contemporary political situation. What are your ideas on proceeding this research in the next future?
Oh, who's that? That's such a kind question, isn't it? Very kind. As said, I have like about 10 lectures on different, basically what I'm doing is I started in 1992 and my end date is still open, but it's somewhere around 2025. That's at this moment the projection of when all West Balkan states have become a part of the European Union. I mean, I don't say that's going to happen, but that's the projected date. So I have a begin date and an end date, which captures about 30 years, a little bit more of the European Union. And then within that, I make like these themes, political themes, that have been very important within the short history of the European Union. And around that, I mean, that's a theme, for example, the Euro crisis or the migration crisis. I mean, the usual suspects. I mean, that's also the idea that they should be usual suspects because they are kind of very important moments within this small project that we have till now. And around that, I'm clustered around these themes. I'm looking for artists who have from different countries, member states, have reacted to that topic. For example, the migration crisis is really very clear, right? I mean, there's so many artists that have responded to the migration crisis within a European context. I mean, that's of course also already transnational, but at the same time, there are these issues. And that an Italian artist might respond to that very differently than from a Hungarian or a Dutch artist. So I think along the way, it becomes more interwoven also, but because I'm dealing with these themes within a timeline. You know, I'm taking a certain kind of chronology from 1992 till 2025 about. And so the next topic what I would really like to work on is this question about European Islam, I think, because no one has really done that work, and there's so many artists that I already have talked to and discovered during my time here in Berlin, that it deserves to be more open and deserves to be brought together to see what comes out of that, you know, how that can help us to make tangible that very difficult topic often to talk about. So that will be a future project, a very near future project, I think.
And I think a very timely and important project as well. So thank you so much, Sjoukje, for this wonderful talk. It's been very inspiring, and I think we would all love to be here in person and continue the conversation with you over a beautiful dinner, which we will have to postpone, sadly. But thank you again for this, and everybody looks forward to you know, what will come. And it's, you know, it's not just a history of contemporary European art, but also a history of recent Europe that you're writing. And I think that's really fascinating, kind of that doubled aim that you're proposing. So thank you again. And also thank you to the Stiftung Brandenburger Tor, to Frau Fenner for all her support, to the tech team, which is invisible, but without the tech team, nothing would have been done. And yes, so thank you all for this evening, which has been a great pleasure.
I mean, I would say in the Corona pandemic time, the technical staff is just more and more important. That we don't see you, right?
So thank you.
That's my way of saying thank you too. Yeah.